On a Wednesday morning in October of 2009, Margot Vaillancourt stood at the edge of her equipment shed in Lac-Saint-Jean, Quebec, and watched a transport truck back down her gravel lane with the last seed drill she would ever order repaired through Beaumont Agricultural Supply. She didn't know that yet. She was holding a work order, and she was thinking about the 3 other drills sitting behind the shed with cracked distribution heads and worn coulter mounts, and she was thinking she had maybe 2 months of spare inventory to get through the worst of them before seeding season. She was not thinking about what would happen after that. That came later. Let me tell you about Margot Vaillancourt, because you need to understand the woman before you can understand what she did. Margot was 52 years old in 2009, and she had been repairing and rebuilding pneumatic seeding equipment in the Lac-Saint-Jean region for 24 years, not servicing it seasonally, not cleaning it up and reselling it, rebuilding it from the ground up as the sole operator of Vaillancourt Mécanique Agricole, a repair and fabrication shop on Rang des Épinets, 12 kilometers outside Roberval, that she had built on a property her mother had left her. The building had a timber frame she had raised with 3 neighbors in 1991, a packed gravel floor she had poured herself in sections over 2 summers, and a pneumatic calibration bench she had assembled from components she'd sourced out of a closing implement dealer in Chicoutimi in 1998 and kept running ever since through a combination of electrical knowledge and the kind of mechanical stubbornness that the Lac-Saint-Jean region produces in certain people the way it produces blueberries, quietly, abundantly, and with very little encouragement from outside. The sign above the shop door was hand-lettered. The invoice book was paper until 2005. Margot did not believe in replacing things that were still doing their job. She had started the shop in 1985 with a welding table, a used drill press, a set of precision calipers she'd bought from a retiring machinist in Alma, and a reputation built from 6 years of doing field repairs for her neighbors, at prices that reflected what the work actually cost rather than what the market would bear. Her father, Émile Vaillancourt, had farmed the same land for 40 years and had taught her that equipment is either running or it isn't, and that a person who understands why it isn't running is worth more than every parts catalog ever printed. Émile had also taught her that the farmers who couldn't afford new equipment were not lesser farmers. They were often the better ones, because they had learned to make things last. Margot had carried that lesson for 24 years, and it was visible in every piece of equipment that came out of her shop. Her work didn't come back with the same problem twice. The grain farmers and dairy producers and potato growers from 3 counties who had found their way to Rang des Épinets had done so the same way farmers everywhere find good repair shops, through word that travels at the co-op and at the grain elevator and at the table in the back of the hardware store where the older men drink coffee on Tuesday mornings. The word about Margot Vaillancourt was specific. She could fix the old drills, the ones the dealers had stopped stocking parts for. The ones with the cast iron distribution housings and the older seed metering systems that the manufacturers had quietly stopped supporting sometime in the early 2000s when the equipment was technically still running, but not generating enough warranty work to justify keeping the supply chain open. Beaumont Agricultural Supply was the reason she had always been able to fix them. They were a regional distributor out of Trois-Rivières that had been supplying parts for agricultural equipment going back to the 1960s, including the precision components for pneumatic seeding systems that the national chains had long since stopped carrying, wear plates, distribution heads, metering wheels, finger pickups, seed tube inserts, the internal components that kept older drills accurate. Beaumont had stocked them because their founder, a man named Gaston Beaumont, had believed that a farmer who couldn't afford a new $50,000 drill deserved to keep his $15,000 one running. Gaston had built his business on that conviction for 30 years. Gaston Beaumont retired in 2004. His business was purchased by a farm supply consolidator based in Ontario the following year. The new owners spent 2 years reviewing the parts inventory against a profitability model and then began discontinuing product lines that did not meet their margin requirements. In September of 2009, they sent letters to their account holders informing them that 280 part numbers were being permanently discontinued effective 60 days from the date of the letter. Margot received her letter on a Thursday. She read it at her workbench. She read it twice, then set it on top of a distribution housing she was boring out for a farmer in Saint Félicien, and she stood there for a long time without moving. Of the 280 discontinued part numbers, 78 were components she used regularly. Regularly meaning that without them, there were entire generations of seeding equipment she could no longer repair. Older Vaterstad units, older Flexicoil air seeders. A whole family of mid-range drills from a Canadian manufacturer that had been absorbed into a larger company in the 1990s, and whose service parts had been orphaned in the supply chain ever since. The equipment was still in the fields. The farmers who owned it could not afford to replace it. They needed someone who could fix it. Let me tell you what Margot did in the 60 days after that letter, because most people would have begun calling their customers to explain the situation. Margot did not do that. Margot drove to Trois-Rivières. She drove there in her 2003 Dodge Ram with a notebook on the passenger seat and a list of every part number she needed. She arrived at Beaumont's warehouse on a Monday morning and asked to speak with whoever was managing the liquidation. That person turned out to be a 29-year-old man named Brandon Keefe, who wore a company fleece with the new parent organization's logo stitched on the chest, and who explained to Margot with practiced efficiency that the discontinued inventory was available for purchase at a 35% discount before the liquidation deadline. Margot asked how much inventory remained across the part numbers she needed. Brandon Keefe pulled up a spreadsheet. There was, depending on her usage rates, somewhere between 2 and 5 years of stock remaining. Margot said she wanted all of it. She did not have the money for all of it. She had $38,000 in her operating account and a line of credit at Caisse Desjardins in Roberval that she had opened 15 years earlier for equipment purchases and had never fully drawn on. The invoice for the liquidated inventory, after the discount, came to $91,000. Margot went to her truck, sat in the parking lot of Beaumont Agricultural Supplies Trois-Rivières warehouse for 19 minutes, and then went back inside and told Brandon Keefe she would take it. She called the case from the parking lot. The loan officer she spoke with was a woman named Denise Poirier, who had processed financing for Margot's shop equipment twice before, and who listened to the explanation without interrupting. Denise said she could arrange a secured note against the shop property by end of week. Margot said that would work. She rented a box truck, hired her neighbor's son to drive the second load, and came back to Lac Saint Jean with $91,000 worth of agricultural parts in 2 trucks, and spent the better part of 5 days building steel shelving along the north wall of her shop to hold all of it. Her daughter, Isabel, came by on the 3rd evening and stood in the doorway and looked at the rows of parts bins and cardboard boxes and wire baskets of seed metering components and said, quietly, that she hoped her mother knew what she was doing. Margot said she did. She wasn't entirely certain. But she said it in the same tone she used when she told a farmer she could fix something before she'd taken it apart, which was the tone of a person who had been right enough times that the uncertainty no longer changed the answer. Have you ever watched someone make a decision that looked reckless from the outside and methodical from the inside? That's what Margot Vaillancourt did in that parking lot. She was not panicking, she was calculating dollars. She had been keeping records since 1985, a shop log in a series of identical hardcover notebooks that documented every piece of equipment she had repaired, every part number she had ordered, every farmer she had worked with. She knew her usage rates the way she knew the back roads between Roberval and St. Prime. She knew exactly which components failed most often in the equipment her customers ran, exactly how many she needed in a year, and exactly how long the inventory she had just purchased would last her. She had bought time. Specifically, she had bought somewhere between 3 and 6 years of time, depending on how the work came in. She also had a plan for what to do with that time. Let me tell you about the plan, because this is the part where Margot Vaillancourt stopped being a woman with a parts problem and started being something else. The components she had purchased from Beaumont were finished parts manufactured to specific tolerances. But Margot had been working with this equipment for 24 years. She knew the geometry of every major component. She knew the materials, cast iron housings, hardened steel wear plates, nylon and UHMW polyethylene for seed tube liners and metering wheels, aluminum for certain distribution heads. She knew the tolerances because she had been measuring and fitting these parts for 2 decades, and because she had in her shop the equipment to measure anything: a surface plate, a granite flat, a set of gauge blocks, and a precision bore gauge she had calibrated herself against known standards. What she had in her shop was a mill, a lathe, a MIG and TIG welder, a drill press, a surface grinder she had bought from a closing job shop in Jonquière in 2003, and the calibration bench. She also had a plasma cutter she had added in 2007 for cutting wear plate steel. What she did not have was a source for raw material: the plate steel, the cast iron blanks, the UHMW rod stock, the aluminum bar that she could machine into finished components. She spent the first 4 months after the Trois-Rivières trip finding those sources. She drove to steel service centers in Chicoutimi and Jonquière. She called a plastics distributor in Quebec City that could supply UHMW and nylon rod stock on 2-week lead times. She located a small foundry in the eastern townships that could pour cast iron to custom specifications if she provided drawings. She found a heat-treating shop in Drummondville that could harden wear surfaces on steel components she machined in-house. She built, piece by piece, a supply network that reached back to raw materials and that she could feed from her shop on Rang des Epnets, using her own equipment. It took her 2.5 years to build it fully. During those 2.5 years, she was also running the shop, repairing equipment, keeping her customers in the field. She worked 6 days a week, and on the Saturdays she worked past dark. Isabelle would sometimes drive out from Roberval and sit at the small table Margot kept near the shop door for paperwork and coffee. They ate together those evenings with seating components spread across the workbench between them, and Margot explained what she was working on, and Isabelle listened. And those evenings were ordinary in the way that ordinary things only reveal themselves to be valuable much later. By 2012, Margot could manufacture from raw material 49 of the 78 part numbers she had originally purchased from Beaumont. Not approximations, exact functional equivalents machined and fabricated to the same tolerances as the original components, often from superior material. UHMW seed tube liners that outlasted the originals by a factor of 2 because she had selected a higher density grade. Hardened steel wear plates cut from 400 series plate and heat treated to a surface hardness the original manufacturer had never bothered specifying, but that Margot knew from 2 decades of watching where the parts failed. For the remaining 29 part numbers, cast housings, complex multi-part assemblies, precision components requiring tooling she didn't have. She had located alternative suppliers or developed modifications that allowed available components to serve the original function. She kept the Beaumont inventory as a buffer and drew it down carefully, using her fabricated parts wherever she could. The shelves along the north wall were organized by equipment family, then by part function, then by the customer history notes she had transferred from her shop logs. Every bin had a label. Every label had a reorder point written in marker on the back. Let me tell you about what happened in 2013, because that's when the other shops started calling. There were across Quebec's agricultural regions perhaps 20 independent implement repair shops that had been in the same position as Margot in 2009. They had received the same letter from Beaumont. Most of them had bought what they could afford, which was not much, and had spent the intervening years watching their ability to service older pneumatic drills slowly narrow as their parts inventory depleted. By 2013, several had stopped quoting on certain equipment families entirely. They were turning away work. Farmers who had relied on them for years were being told that the parts no longer existed. That's not quite what travels. What travels is its opposite. The word that had been moving quietly through the agricultural community of central Quebec for the better part of 2 years was that Margot Vaillancourt in Lac-Saint-Jean could still fix the old drills. Nobody knew exactly how, but she had parts nobody else had, and the parts were correct, and the price was fair. The first call came from a shop in St. Hyacinthe. The man who called was named Félix Durocher, who had been repairing farm equipment for 18 years and who needed a set of seed metering wheels for a mid-90s flexi-coil that he had promised to a cash crop farmer before the week was out. Felix had called every distributor he could find. He called Margot as a last option, half expecting nothing. Margot told him to come by on Friday if he wanted to save himself the shipping. Felix drove 4 hours to Lac-Saint-Jean a Friday morning, and Margot handed him a set of metering wheels she had turned from UHMW rod on her lathe and finish machined to the original profile dimensions. Felix held one of them in both hands and turned it slowly, checking the cell geometry against the one he had brought as a sample. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "How much?" Margot told him. Felix said that was less than he'd been paying Beaumont. Margot said she knew. After Félix Durocher, there were others. Slowly at first, 3 or 4 shops in the first year calling about specific components for specific jobs. But the calls kept coming and Margot kept answering them, and by 2015 she had a secondary business operating alongside her repair work, manufacturing and supplying obsolete seating equipment components to independent repair shops across Quebec, Ontario, and into the Prairie provinces. She had not advertised. She did not have a website. She had a second hardcover notebook for wholesale parts orders, organized by customer shop and by component type, and she restocked raw material when it ran low and machined parts to order when someone needed something she didn't carry on the shelf. The irony, which Margot understood without making much of it, was that the Ontario consolidator that had acquired Beaumont had spent 2007 and 2008 running margin analyses on exactly this market and had concluded it was not worth serving. By 2016, Margot's component supply business was generating more revenue than her equipment repair. She had not set out to build a manufacturing operation. She had set out to keep her own shop able to do its job. Everything else had followed because the need existed and no one else was meeting it. Let me tell you about 2017 because that's when the CNC arrived. Margot had been watching her manual lathe struggle on certain seed distribution head work for the better part of a year. The internal geometry on some of the older cast housings required interpolated cuts that her lathe could approximate but not reliably hold over a production run. She needed a different approach. She found it through her daughter, who by that point had been working as a machinist in an aerospace subcontracting shop in Mirabel for 4 years, and who knew what to look for in used CNC equipment. Isabel located a 2004 Mazak turning center at a plant liquidation in Boucherville. It was in functional condition with a worn turret that needed new tool holders and a control issue that had been misdiagnosed as catastrophic but turned out to be a failed encoder. The asking price was $16. Margot drove to Boucherville, inspected the machine for 2 hours, determined that the mechanical condition was sound, and bought it. Isabel came home for 3 weeks and rebuilt the control system and replaced the turret tool holders with a set of cap toe holders she sourced from an industrial supplier in Montreal. When the Mazak was running, Margot moved it to the center of the shop floor. She watched Isabel program the machine with the same expression she used watching complicated equipment for the first time: attentive, careful, not quite skeptical, but not yet certain. She understood the parts the machine made. She could measure them, fit them, verify them. She did not pretend to understand the CAM programming. That was Isabel's domain. Margot's domain was knowing whether the output was right. Isabel programmed, Margot inspected. Between them, they covered the ground that needed covering. Isabel had moved back to Lac Saint Jean by 2018. Not because Margot had asked her to, because the work was there and because Isabel had, somewhere in her 4 years in aerospace tolerances, developed the same fundamental relationship to precision that her mother had and her grandfather had before both of them. The understanding that a part is either correct or it isn't, and that correct is not a negotiable standard. Let me tell you about the morning in August of 2022 when Margot Vaillancourt turned 65, because that morning tells you something about what those years had built. Isabel arrived at the shop at 7 and found her mother at the surface grinder finishing a batch of wear plates that needed to ship before noon. Theodore Garneau, a young machinist from Alma who had come to the shop 2 years earlier out of the technical college in Jonquière, arrived at 7:15 and started the Mazak on a parts program he had set up the previous evening. A woman named Sylvie Paquette, who ran parts inventory and shipping and had rebuilt the storage system from scratch in her first 6 months at the shop, had the shipping station organized by 7:30. The shop ran the way good equipment runs, every part doing its work, no motion wasted, the whole thing coherent. Isabel brought a cake at noon. They ate it at the workbench with distribution housings on one side and a bin of metering wheels on the other, the way Margot had eaten dinner with her daughter at that same bench years earlier when she was building shelves for the Beaumont inventory. Margot was not someone who marked occasions with speeches. She ate her cake and looked at the shelves along the north wall, not the original shelves she had built in 2009, which had been reorganized and partially replaced twice as the operation evolved, but the current system, labeled and mapped and integrated with the parts database Isabel had built in 2019, and she said, to no particular person, that they were in good shape. Isabel said, yeah, they were. Let me tell you what those shelves held, because the inventory tells the story more accurately than any description of the person. There were in the parts room of Vaillancourt Mécanique Agricole in August of 2022 components for 38 distinct seeding equipment platforms spanning 4 decades of North American agricultural equipment manufacture. There were parts for drills whose manufacturers had been absorbed, dissolved, or rebranded so many times that the original product identities had become nearly untraceable, but whose mechanical specifications Margot had documented in her shop logs across decades of hands-on work with the equipment. There were components machined by Margot's hands and Isabel's hands and Theodore's hands, sitting in labeled bins alongside components purchased from specialty suppliers, and the carefully rationed remainder of the original Beaumont stock, which Margot had managed so precisely over 13 years that she still held small quantities of certain items for jobs where her fabricated equivalent wasn't quite right. The shops that called Vaillancourt Mécanique in 2022 were not the same shops that had called in 2013. Some of those original shops had closed, but new operations had come up behind them, run by younger technicians who had never known a time when you could order a metering wheel for a 1996 air-seater and have it arrive in a week from a regional distributor. For those shops, Margot's operation was not a last resort, it was the first call. It was the place you called because they had it or could make it, and because the price was honest and the work was right, and the people who answered the phone understood what you were dealing with. In the spring of 2023, a procurement officer from a large grain farming cooperative in Saskatchewan called the shop. His name was Warren Fitch, and the cooperative operated a fleet of older large-frame air drills at several of their member operations, equipment that had been running for 20 years, and that the cooperative had been maintaining rather than replacing because the replacement cost across their membership would have been, in Warren's words, considerable. The original manufacturer's parts supply had been effectively depleted for 3 years. Warren had found Margot's name through a contact at an independent shop in Lethbridge who had told him that if the components didn't exist anywhere conventional, he should call Vaillancourt in Lac Saint Jean because they either had them or would know how to make them. Margot asked Warren to send her the equipment specifications and a parts list. He sent a package that arrived 4 days later, original manufacturer documentation, parts diagrams, and a list of 17 components the cooperative needed. Margot spread the documents across her workbench and spent an evening going through them. She recognized the platform architecture from a single unit she had repaired for a Lac Saint Jean farmer who had purchased it secondhand from a prairie operation in 2008. She went to her shop logs, pulled the notebook from 2008, found the entry, and cross-referenced it against Warren's list. Of the 17 components, she could manufacture 14 with existing equipment and raw material sources. The remaining 3 were cast assemblies that would require patterns and foundry work. She called the foundry in the eastern townships. They could pour them if she sent drawings and a pattern. She quoted Warren a price and a delivery time. Warren was quiet for a moment and then said the price was lower than he had anticipated and the timeline was shorter. Margot said she had the equipment and the knowledge and the material, and there was no reason for it to be otherwise. The cooperative became a regular customer. By the end of 2024, the shop had supplied components to keep 27 large-frame drills operating across 3 prairie provinces. 2 of the cooperative's field technicians visited the shop in the summer of 2024, and they walked the floor with expressions that Margot recognized. The expression she had seen on Felix DeRocher's face in 2013 when he turned that metering wheel in his hands. The expressions of someone finding something they had not expected to find where they had not expected to find it. The hardcover notebooks are still on the shelf above Margot's desk, 38 of them now in 2 rows, organized by year from 1985 to the present. Margot added to them for 24 years before Isabel built the database, and she has continued adding to them since. Because the database captures transactions, but the notebooks capture what happened and what she was thinking, and what she noticed about the equipment that the transaction record doesn't contain. When a new equipment platform comes in that the shop hasn't seen before, Margot pulls the relevant technical documentation and reads it the way she was taught to read it. Completely, from the front, not skipping to the part that seems relevant, and then she goes to the floor. The surface grinder from Jonquière is still running. It has had one spindle rebuild and a new electromagnetic chuck controller that Isabel sourced from an industrial supplier in Toronto. It is not the same machine it was in 2003 in the sense that its worn components have been replaced. It is exactly the same machine in the sense that it does the same work to the same standard, and the knowledge of how to keep it doing that work has moved from Margot to Isabel to Theodore, who now runs it most mornings while Isabel manages the CNC work and the more complex fabrication. The company that acquired Beaumont Agricultural Supply was itself purchased in 2017 by a national farm supply chain operating 290 retail locations across Canada. Their online parts catalog does not list metering wheel components for air seeders manufactured before 2005. The search function is working correctly. The parts are simply not in the system. But the people who need them badly enough find out where they are. They end up on Rang des Epinettes in Lac-Saint-Jean, talking to Isabelle Vaillancourt or Théodore Garneau or Sylvie Paquette, and they leave with what they came for, and sometimes they ask how the shop has components that no one else carries, and the answer is always the same: dollars. A woman drove to Trois-Rivières in 2009 and bought everything that remained. And then she spent the next several years learning to make what she couldn't buy, and she taught the people around her to do the same, and the shop never stopped running, and the knowledge never left the building, and the machines that were worth keeping were kept and maintained and passed to hands that understood what they were for. There is a photograph on the wall above the workbench near the door. It shows Margot and her father, Émile, standing beside a seed drill that Émile had helped a neighbor repair in the late 1970s, somewhere on a farm lane outside Roberval. Margot is maybe 12 in the photograph, standing beside her father with her arms at her sides, looking at the drill the way he is looking at it, the way you look at something you are in the process of understanding and have not yet finished with. The photograph has been on that wall since Margot opened the shop. The workbench beneath it has changed. The tools around it have changed. The people working in the building have changed. The photograph has not changed, and the way of looking at a machine that it captures has not changed either, and that is not coincidence. That is exactly the point. That is what happens when a person decides that what they know is worth more than what someone else's profitability model says they should need, and builds accordingly, and teaches the people around them to build the same way, and keeps the equipment running that everyone else decided wasn't worth keeping, because they understood that the value of a thing is not determined by whether it appears in a distributor's current catalog, but by whether it does the work when the work is needed, and whether someone cared enough to understand it well enough to keep it doing that. I keep thinking about the 19 minutes Margot spent sitting in that parking lot in Trois-Rivières. Not the decision itself, the 19 minutes before it. Sitting in the cab of her truck with $91,000 on an invoice and a line of credit she had never fully drawn on, and the knowledge that she could walk away and call her customers and explain the situation, and no one would blame her for it. That was the easier path. That was the path that most reasonable people would have taken. She didn't take it. What strikes me about that moment isn't the courage it took, though it took real courage. What strikes me is what made the courage possible. Margot didn't walk back into that warehouse on a feeling. She walked back in because she had spent 24 years paying attention. Every repair, every part number, every machine that came through her bay doors. She had kept records not because anyone told her to, but because she understood, somewhere deep in how she had been taught to work. That knowledge is only useful if you can find it again when you need it. That discipline, that quiet, unglamorous habit of writing things down and filing them correctly and maintaining the log even when the day was already long, that's what turned a parking lot in Trois-Rivières into a calculation instead of a gamble. Dollars. There's a word for that kind of thinking. It's not ambition. It's not strategy exactly. It's something closer to integrity of mind, the practice of being honest about what you know, honest about what you don't, and honest about what the numbers actually say, even when the numbers are frightening. Margot knew her usage rates. She knew her equipment. She knew what the inventory would last her and what she would need to do before it ran out. Dollars. She didn't need anyone to tell her the decision was sound. She had the evidence in a series of hardcover notebooks going back to 1985. Dollars. And then there's what she did with the time she bought herself. She didn't coast. She didn't run out the Beaumont inventory and hope something better came along. She spent those years building, piece by piece, the capability to not need the inventory at all. That's a different kind of strength than the parking lot decision. That's the kind that doesn't happen in a single moment. Dollars. That's the kind that happens at 6 in the morning and on late Saturdays and in drives to Chicoutimi and Drummondville and phone calls to foundries and the slow accumulation of knowing how to do one more thing than you knew how to do the week before. Felix Durocher drove 4 hours to Lac Saint Jean because that work was real, because Margot had put in the years that made it real. Dollars. I think about Emile teaching his daughter to look at a machine the way you look at something you're not finished with yet. That's in the photograph on the wall. That's also in everything Margot built. And it's in Isabel now, in the way she programs the Mazak and reads a technical drawing and asks the right questions before she starts the cut. Dollars. What gets passed down isn't equipment. Equipment can be replaced. What gets passed down is the willingness to understand something completely, to not skip to the part you think you need, to sit with the full picture until it tells you what it actually is. That takes honesty. It takes patience. And it takes the kind of steadiness that doesn't require an audience or a reward or even the certainty of a good outcome. Dollars. Margot had all three, and she gave all three away.